After my grandparents passed away, I inherited $26 million US. My parents demanded it when I refused. I always had a special relationship with my grandparents. They taught me about kindness, respect, and the value of simplicity. When they died, I thought my grief would be the biggest challenge I'd face. But what came next was even more devastating. Receiving a millionaire inheritance changed my life, not just because of the money, but because it revealed the true intentions of the people around me. Overnight, I discovered how much greed can transform a family, and how much courage it takes to protect what truly matters. This story is about losses, secrets, confrontations, and above all, choices. I'm very happy to have you here. Follow my story to the end and comment from which city you are watching. I want to know how far my story reached. The call dropped and I stood there, phone in hand, feeling the world collapse around me. It was Carlos who told me. His voice choked, paused, as if the words hurt more than the silence. My grandparents had been in an accident and didn't make it. I felt a hole open inside me, as if a part of my history had been torn away without warning. I didn't cry immediately. I was paralyzed, as if the news was a poorly fitted piece of reality. In the days that followed, time seemed to stand still. I refused visits, messages, and even my mother's insistent calls. Nothing mattered to me except the absence that filled every corner of my memory. The house I shared with plants and books became a cocoon of pain. Sleeping was impossible. Eating seemed like an unnecessary effort. All I could remember was the smell of Grandma's apple pie and Grandpa's firm hands holding mine last Christmas. Outside, the world continued indifferent to my pain. Cars passed, neighbors chatted, but I remained trapped in that frozen moment in time. Memories came in waves. Their garden swing, handwritten birthday cards, whispered advice on summer afternoons. I tried to write a farewell letter, but I cried before finishing the first line. It was too soon to accept, too late to understand. On the day of the funeral, I walked to the coffin as one walks to an abyss. I had no strength to say anything. I just placed my hand on Grandma's coffin and closed my eyes. It was my silent way of thanking them, of asking forgiveness for not being ready to lose them. Then I returned home alone. And I stayed there in the dark, trying to breathe with a chest tight with longing. Little did I know that pain was just the beginning. 2 weeks later, I was called to the office of Matthew Carter, my grandparents' trusted lawyer. The room was silent, elegant, almost too impersonal for such an intimate moment. My parents, Brandon, and Aunt Margaret were present, all with restrained expressions, as if waiting for a prize or a sentence. I felt out of place, as if I had invaded territory that didn't belong to me. Matthew opened the envelope with a solemnity that chilled the atmosphere. He began to read the will calmly until he reached the part that changed everything. Emma Sullivan inherits entirely the assets and properties left by Harold and Grace Sullivan. Absolute silence. For a second I thought I had heard wrong. I looked at him, expecting a correction, but he just nodded, firm, as if he had anticipated that reaction. My heart started beating faster. I tried to understand why my grandparents would do this. Why me? Why everything? I was just the granddaughter, the furthest from the direct line. My mother seemed about to get up. My father clenched his fists under the table. Brandon snorted like a spoiled child. And Aunt Margaret, she widened her eyes as if she had witnessed a crime. Matthew continued explaining the legal terms, but the words no longer made sense to me. I could only think of the summer spent at my grandparents' house, the conversations at dusk, the letters they always wrote me on my birthdays. Did they already know what they would do? Did they prepare me for this? The weight of responsibility began to settle even before I could react. The words kept echoing in my head. Emma Sullivan inherits everything. As soon as Matthew finished speaking, the office erupted in voices. My mother stood up, indignant, accusing him of manipulation. This is absurd. She must have influenced my parents. My father said nothing at first, but his gaze was like a blade, cold, calculating. Brandon shook his head, muttering something about injustice, while Aunt Margaret began to cry loudly, theatrically. I remained motionless. It was like being in the middle of a storm without shelter. Every word felt like a stone thrown at me. No one asked if I was okay. No one wanted to understand. They only saw numbers, properties, money. And suddenly I was to blame for everything. For being close to my grandparents. For receiving what deep down they believed belonged to them. Matthew tried to intervene, reminding them that the will was legitimate and uncontestable, but no one listened. I just wanted to get out of there, to disappear. I felt my eyes sting, but I refused to cry in front of them. I stood up, trembling, trying to maintain my composure. But before leaving the room, I heard my father say in a low, poisonous voice, "This isn't over yet." I went home in silence. The voices still echoed inside me. The image of my mother screaming, of my brother looking at me like a traitor, all of it crushed me inside. I never imagined my family would react with such hatred. I always thought blood meant something, that bonds didn't break like that. But there, for the first time, I doubted it. At that moment, I realized my family had become my enemy. I locked the front door and collapsed onto the couch. The will was still in my bag, as if it were a bomb about to explode. I picked up one of my grandmother's old letters and read it, seeking solace in the words she always chose with such care. "Be firm, even when you feel fragile," she used to say. But I felt exactly that, fragile. Like someone who had been thrown into a battlefield without armor. That night I didn't sleep. I rummaged through old photos, reread notes kept in boxes, searching for meaning where there was only longing. I tried to recall conversations I had with my grandparents last Christmas. They seemed worried, but I never imagined they were preparing something so grand. Perhaps deep down they knew the real test would come after their deaths. In the following days, I remained isolated. I refused calls, especially from my mother. The wound was too open for any attempt at contact. My head spun in circles. What if I refused the inheritance? What if I simply gave up everything and left it behind? But a part of me knew it wasn't just about money. It was about honoring the only two people who had always welcomed me without asking for anything in return. I went to the small park where I used to walk with my grandfather and sat on our usual bench. I closed my eyes and imagined his voice guiding me. I didn't have all the answers, but a certainty grew within me. I couldn't turn back. Not after everything they had done for me. This wasn't a gift. It was a legacy, and I needed to be strong enough to defend it. I just wanted to go back in time, but it was already too late. I went to my parents' house on an impulse, thinking that perhaps face to face we could talk. The living room looked the same as always, but the atmosphere was different. My father sat like a king on his throne. My mother with her arms crossed. Brandon didn't even show up. "We need to talk," my father said. And then the real pressure began. They wanted me to sign a document. They said it was a way to keep the family together, that the assets would be managed responsibly if they passed to my father. I listened in silence, but my stomach churned. Carolyn tried a softer tone, saying I wouldn't know what to do with so much money. "You've always been more emotional, Emma. We know how to handle this better than you." I tried to argue, to say I needed time, but they didn't listen. My father leaned forward, his eyes fixed on mine. "Sign it, or you're no longer part of this family." The words fell like stones. I felt like an intruder in the house where I grew up. The obedient girl I had been for so long began to disappear, replaced by a woman cornered but firm. I slowly stood up, clutching my bag tightly. I didn't say a word. My parents looked at me as if I were a traitor. And as I left, I heard my mother murmur something about disappointment. But the biggest disappointment there was realizing that their love always had a price. And now that it was no longer convenient, I was disposable. "Sign it, or you're no longer part of this family." Outside, my breath came in sobs. I walked aimlessly through the streets, trying to understand how everything had turned into this. They didn't just want the assets, they wanted to erase me from the will and from their own history. The next day, I received an anonymous letter with a copy of the document they had forced me to sign. The threat was clear. If I didn't give in, I would face consequences. The messages started coming. Brandon sent me audios with sarcasm and insults. My mother called me in fake tears, alternating between emotional blackmail and cruel accusations. My father, always cold, sent a message through a lawyer. "We're just getting started." The pressure came from all sides, but I knew that giving in now would be losing everything, including myself. I sought out Matthew, who advised me to keep my distance and save every piece of contact. He had already foreseen this would happen. He said my grandparents had left more than assets, they had left means to protect me. But I needed to endure. I cried in the car after the conversation. I wanted to run somewhere safe, but I realized that place might no longer exist. That night, I received a message with a photo of me entering Matthew's office. It was surveillance. It was invasion. It was fear. But it was also confirmation that they were willing to do anything. And if I wasn't prepared, I could lose more than the inheritance. I could lose myself. I was expelled not only from their house but from their lives. The notification arrived unannounced, in a white envelope left at my door. I read the words with a racing heart. My lease had been terminated by a special clause. The signature at the bottom paralyzed me. It was from my father's property management company. In less than 48 hours I would have to leave. The apartment, my last refuge, was no longer mine. I felt betrayed by every wall, every memory built there. I tried to contact the real estate agency, but they just repeated that the notice was legal and final. I called my mother in despair, and she just replied, "Whoever chooses to leave the family loses their privileges." It was as if I were an intruder in my own life. I walked through the rooms in silence, touching the furniture as one says goodbye to something very dear. Even my home had been turned into a battlefield. The next day, I started packing my things aimlessly. Each closed box was another weight on my chest. I thought of friends, of coworkers, but I didn't want to involve anyone in that storm. It was shame, it was fear, it was pain. I spent the night sitting on the living room floor, staring at the empty walls, trying to find courage amidst the abandonment. I knew my grandparents would never do this to me. They taught me that home was where there was love. And there was nothing left but silence and bitterness. As I closed the last box, I felt that the door closing wasn't just physical. It was symbolic. It was proof that from now on everything would depend only on me. Even my home had been taken from me. Before leaving the apartment, I remembered the envelope Matthew had given me days ago. I hadn't opened it, perhaps for fear of finding more pain within it. But on that gray morning it was my only hope. I tore open the seal with trembling fingers. Inside there was a handwritten letter from my grandparents, and a key attached to a white rabbit keychain just like the one I used as a child. The letter said that, should I ever feel lost, I should go to their old house. There you will find more than walls. You will find answers, read the last sentence. I felt tears fall without resistance. Grandma's delicate handwriting felt like a hug from the past. I took the key and held it tight, as if it were a compass capable of guiding me in the dark. I quickly packed my things without looking back. I took a taxi and asked to be driven to the house where I had spent so many summers. On the way, the silence of the car allowed me to relive moments. My grandfather's voice calling from the garden, my grandmother's cinnamon scent wafting from the kitchen. That gave me strength. For the first time in days, I felt I wasn't completely alone. When the gate appeared before me, my heart tightened. It was old, yes, but still imposing. I got out of the car, took a deep breath, and put the key in the lock. The click was almost ceremonial. The door creaked as if waking from a long sleep. I entered slowly, with the steps of someone returning to a sacred place. That rabbit keychain was more than a symbol, it was hope. The familiar scent of old wood enveloped me like an invisible blanket. The house seemed intact, as if my grandparents had just stepped out for a moment and would return at any instant. I walked through each room carefully, touching objects as one touches relics. There were photos on the shelves, handmade quilts, books marked with grandma's post-its. The past breathed in every corner of that house. I went to the kitchen and made some tea, repeating the same gestures I had seen my grandmother make hundreds of times. I sat in Grandpa's rocking chair, which still creaked the same way. For a few minutes I allowed myself to close my eyes and imagine they were there. But the silence was overwhelming. Their absence screamed louder than any memory. That night, I made a bed in the old guest room. The walls had children's drawings I had made years ago. I snuggled into the carefully kept sheets and cried as I hadn't cried since the funeral. Not out of weakness but out of relief. At least there was truth. There was love. Even in the pain, I felt safer than I had ever been in my parents' house. Before going to sleep, I opened the window and looked at the starry sky. I whispered a thank you, that perhaps no one would hear, but which I needed to say. For the first time in a long time I fell asleep without fear. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but that night at least I was home. The silence of that house was a scream within me. The next morning the sound of a car at the gate woke me. I looked out the window and saw Matthew get out with a briefcase under his arm. I opened the door and invited him in, feeling an unexpected relief at seeing someone who represented stability. He complimented the house, said my grandparents had prepared everything for me to come there, in case things got out of control. We sat in the living room, and he spread the documents on the coffee table. There were accounts, deeds, and most importantly, a letter of instructions left by my grandfather. Emma must be protected, no matter the cost. One passage read. Matthew spoke calmly, explaining that he was already taking legal measures to ensure my safety and block actions by my family. I asked if he knew what my parents might try next. He nodded with a serious look. They will try to destabilize you. But your grandparents thought of everything. Hearing that gave me some peace. They didn't just leave me an inheritance, they left me a plan, a shield. And somehow that gave me courage to face whatever came. Matthew stayed for a few more hours, organizing folders and explaining next steps. Before leaving, he placed his hand on mine and said, "You are not alone, Emma. And they underestimated who you are." I closed the door after he left and allowed myself to smile, even if just for an instant. For the first time I saw a light in the middle of the storm. They thought of everything, even that. In the afternoon I heard footsteps on the porch and went to see who it was. It was Carlos, the old caretaker of the property, with his worn cap and sad eyes. He hugged me tightly, and only then did I realize how much I needed that gesture. We sat in the kitchen and he began to tell me what he knew. There were things my grandparents had hidden, and now it was time for me to discover them. Carlos led me to Grandpa's office. Behind a false bookcase there was a small built-in safe. Inside it were flash drives and cameras. They knew something could happen, so they recorded everything, Carlos said. I was shocked to see the files. The recordings showed moments after the funeral. My father and Brandon breaking into the house and taking hidden jewelry. Watching those images felt like getting punched in the stomach. The coldness on their faces, the naturalness with which they invaded and ransacked, all recorded in high resolution. Carlos said there was more. Audios, documents, and evidence hidden in strategic locations. My grandparents were prepared to face their own family if necessary. I spent hours watching the videos, processing every second. That was more than evidence, it was raw, naked truth immortalized. I felt torn between pain and relief. But above all, I felt I needed to do something with it. My grandparents trusted me. Now it was my turn to act. The images don't lie. And they were all there. That night I couldn't sleep. I decided to explore the house further, searching for any other clues. In Grandma's closet, I found a wooden box with a simple padlock. I used a hairpin to open it. Inside there were 3 notebooks covered with floral fabric, her diaries. With trembling hands, I opened the first one and began to read. The first pages spoke of youth, marriage, the joys of being a grandmother. But soon the accounts took on a darker tone. She described episodes where my father tried to manipulate financial decisions, plans for incapacitation, and even attempts to distance her and my grandfather from me. There were dates, details, and phrases laden with sadness and disappointment. I read until my eyes burned. In several passages, she wrote that I was the only true light in that family. She said that my presence was the hope that their legacy would not be corrupted. That both tore me apart and strengthened me at the same time. Realizing that she saw something in me that I didn't even see myself was a punch and a hug all at once. I closed the diary and hugged it to my chest. Tears flowed unashamedly. My grandparents were no longer physically here, but they had left a map, a lighthouse, a purpose. And in that instant I understood everything they were doing was so that one day I would have the chance to choose to be different. My grandmother already foresaw what was happening. The next morning Carlos called me to the garden. He was accompanied by 2 elderly ladies and an elderly gentleman, all with emotional expressions. They were old friends of my grandparents, trusted people who had been discreetly warned by letters left before their death. They knew you would need help, Carlos said. That deeply moved me. We sat around the porch table, and a strange sense of belonging came over me. I heard old stories, memories shared with affection and respect. They told me about my grandparents' constant concern about my family's ambition, and that, because of this, they had prepared a silent circle of support in case something happened. It was like discovering there was an invisible net around me, carefully and loyally woven. No one was there out of self-interest. They were there out of love for my grandparents and, consequently, for me. One of them, Mr. Walter, even said, "Your grandmother believed in you more than in anyone else." I felt a lump in my throat and a new strength being born within me. I spent the afternoon listening, accepting, and thanking. They didn't have answers for everything, but they had presence. And at that moment, that was all I needed. When they said goodbye, they promised to return with documents, testimonies, and everything that could strengthen me. I closed the gate with a light heart, for the first time in days. They arrived with sad eyes but firm hearts. In the following week, the house took on a new rhythm. Every day, someone new knocked on the door with a story to tell or an envelope in hand. Former accountants, neighbors, even ex-employees of my family's company came. Each brought a piece of the puzzle. The lies that surrounded me began to unravel with surgical precision. The documents revealed fraud, diversion of assets, and old manipulations. I discovered that my parents tried to transfer properties even before my grandparents passed away. There were records of suspicious meetings, offshore accounts, and forged signatures. Matthew gathered everything with professionalism and discretion, preparing a dossier that looked like it came straight from a courtroom movie. Every time I read a new paper, I felt a different cut. How could I have lived so many years without seeing who they truly were? But at the same time, each revelation made me firmer. I needed to be the voice my grandparents no longer had. I needed to honor what they had left, not just assets but truth. Carlos said that was just the beginning, that there was still evidence hidden around the house, in secret rooms and in the attic, where my grandfather kept everything he deemed precious. It felt strange that the house spoke to me now. Every corner hid a clue, an echo of what they wanted to show me. Every new paper was like a knife tearing through their lies. With each visit, with each open box, a new Emma was born within me. Still hurt, yes. There were still nights when I cried in silence. But now there was something different. I was no longer lost. The people around me reminded me of who I was, and how much my grandparents believed in me. That changed everything. The days grew longer and more productive. We organized evidence, assembled folders, aligned dates and facts. The main living room became almost a center of resistance, with papers scattered and low voices exchanging ideas. Every simple gesture, a cup of tea, a note, a piece of advice, brought me a sense of family that I had never felt inside the house where I grew up. Matthew said it wasn't time to act yet, but that the moment was approaching. Until then, we needed to be prepared for any retaliation. And I felt that, even if the battle was difficult, now there was an army by my side. Small, yes, but true. And that's what made the difference. On a rainy night, I sat in the rocking chair on the porch and closed my eyes. The sound of the rain lulled me like a lullaby from the past. I thought of my grandparents, their smiles and their silent hugs. And for the first time, the pain gave way to something new, hope. Perhaps I can win. The doorbell rang loudly and repeatedly. I looked out the window and saw my father's black car parked at the gate. Beside him, Brandon and my mother got out with grim faces and determined steps. Carlos appeared on the porch and gave me a warning look. It wasn't a casual visit. It was an invasion disguised as a conversation. I felt my stomach churn. I opened the gate reluctantly. Before I could say anything, my mother advanced, her eyes full of scorn. "We're here to resolve this civilly," she said, lying with every syllable. They entered as if they still owned the house. They touched the furniture, walked through the rooms, and sat in the living room like kings without a throne. I just watched in silence. My father then pulled an envelope from his jacket. "You'll have a chance to do the right thing," he said. Brandon chuckled in the corner of the room, with the same disdain as always. Carolyn feigned compassion, but her gaze was venomous. They had come prepared and determined, but I was no longer the same girl I had been before. I took a deep breath, standing tall. This house was mine now, not just by right but by love. And I would not allow them to profane it with arrogance and greed. This would be the last time they would enter there, as if they could take something from me without a fight. They entered as owners of something that never belonged to them. My father opened the envelope and pulled out an official-looking contract. It was a transfer of assets agreement. Fraudulent, hastily made with manipulated clauses. "Sign it and everything goes back to normal," he said, as if normalcy were possible after all this. My mother tried to convince me with fake tears. Brandon threatened. You don't want to fight with us, Emma. I looked at the paper and then at each of them. I felt disgust. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. They wanted to erase my grandparents' will as if nothing was worth anything. As if their love could be revoked with a signature. But I knew what to do. And for the first time my voice came out firm and clear. No. That's all. Simple, dry, definitive. They were silent for a second, surprised. Then came the shouts, the threats, the accusations. My mother called it ingratitude. My father insanity. Brandon foolishness. But nothing affected me anymore. I had said what I needed to say, and inside me something was freed. I held the contract with both hands, tore it into 4 pieces and threw it on the floor. They looked at me as if I were crazy, but I was just becoming whole. Carlos watched everything from the doorway with silent pride. He knew that this was a turning point. A real break. I signed with my dignity, not with a pen. The refusal enraged them. My mother abruptly stood up and said that if I didn't leave willingly, they would force me out. Brandon threatened to call a lawyer with connections. My father, always colder, was direct. We'll get you out of here, whether you like it or not. I stood alone before them. But I no longer felt small. Carlos approached and warned that everything was being recorded. The cameras installed by my grandparents still worked, and every word was registered. This made them hesitate for a few moments, but not for long. My mother pointed her finger at me, saying I would regret it. I simply reciprocated with silence. They didn't deserve my words. They left, slamming doors and promising revenge. The gate closed behind them like a sentence. I stood on the porch for a few minutes, absorbing the impact. My body trembled, but it wasn't from fear. It was from relief. For the first time I had not given in. For the first time I was true to myself and my grandparents. I went inside, locked the doors, and leaned against the living room wall. I looked around. This was my trench now. And I knew the war was just beginning. But I also knew I was no longer unarmed. I had evidence, I had allies, and above all I had courage. The war was officially declared. Carlos called me to the office in the late afternoon, looking more serious than usual. He opened a secret drawer built into the wall and pulled out an external hard drive. You need to see this, Emma, he said, connecting the device to the computer. The images that appeared on the screen chilled me. It was my father entering my grandparents' house 2 days after the funeral, accompanied by Brandon. Without ceremony, they began to open drawers, remove paintings, rummage through shelves and closets. They took jewelry, boxes of documents, valuable objects. Brandon even laughed as he put a pocket watch on his wrist. It was like seeing strangers wearing familiar masks. The house where I spent Christmases had become the scene of a planned heist. Carlos paused the video, took a deep breath and said, "This is just one of the recordings. They came more than once." I felt a wave of nausea at such coldness, such certainty of impunity. Their faces, so natural amidst the crime, hurt me more than any words said until then. The pain was deep, but the indignation grew faster. That changed everything. I wasn't just fighting for memory and respect. I was facing a crime committed by my own flesh and blood. And from that moment on, I knew there was no more room for hesitation. Action was needed. And fast. They stole even before the tears dried. I decided to resume reading my grandmother's diaries. What was once pain now was also strategy. Amidst the detailed notes, I found something darker than I imagined. She described secret meetings between my parents and lawyers, where they discussed the possibility of having my grandparents declared incompetent. The goal was to take control of everything before it was too late. She reported phrases my father had said. "They're getting confused. It's the right time to take over." My mother supported it, encouraging the idea that Emma would never know how to manage what she inherited. My grandparents, however, realized the plan in time. And silently they began to protect themselves and to protect me. With each page, the idealized image I still tried to maintain of my family shattered. They didn't make mistakes impulsively. They made mistakes by calculation, by coldness, by greed. My grandmother even predicted that, after their deaths, they would come after me like vultures. "Emma will be the target. I've prepared everything so she won't be alone," she wrote. I closed the diary with trembling hands. What seemed like an exaggeration now made sense. It wasn't just about disaffection. It was about a systematic attempt at destruction. And that demanded something from me that I had never needed so much: courage. It was colder and crueler than I imagined. Matthew arrived the next day with a suitcase full of documents and a determined look. He sat with Carlos and me in the main living room, now transformed into a kind of headquarters. We began to organize all the evidence: videos, documents, testimonies, and diaries. Everything cataloged, reviewed, and separated in chronological order. It was a meticulous job and emotionally heavy. He explained to me that indignation was not enough. We needed an unassailable dossier, combining facts and emotions. One that was not only a defense, but a clear and firm story, capable of sensitizing even the most skeptical. "They will try to turn everything around," he said. "But we will be ready." And for the first time I felt that I had a real chance. By the end of the day, there were 3 main folders. One with criminal evidence, another with historical records of my grandparents' relationship with me, and a third with letters. Letters written by them to me, to the judge, to the world. It was as if they had foreseen everything, including the end. That moved me more than anything else. I closed my eyes, touched the cover of the last folder, and took a deep breath. The confrontation was near. And although fear was still present, something inside me no longer trembled as before. I held the complete story in my hands, and I knew it was time to tell it. They thought they were ready, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. Carlos spent the following days in contact with names that were in my grandparents' letters. People who for years had been a silent part of their lives. And one by one they began to arrive. There were former cooks, gardeners, old business partners, and even a teacher who took care of me in childhood. All brought with them more than memories, they brought loyalty. The living room of the house became a meeting point. Each one had something to say, a piece of the story to complete. Many cried remembering my grandparents. Others showed old notes, cards carefully kept. "They always spoke of you with pride," said an old lady, squeezing my hands. That strengthened me more than any document. We began to assemble timelines, mind maps, recollections of conversations and encounters. It was like building a wall with bricks of truth. They were there of their own volition, moved by the love they felt for my grandparents. None of them would accept seeing that legacy destroyed by greed. And it was there, between hot tea and emotional accounts, that I realized something important. Sometimes, family is not who shares your blood, but who holds your hand in the midst of the storm. And now I had many pairs of hands around me. Firm, present, unshakable. There, I realized that blood is not always family. 2 days later, Matthew brought 2 unexpected visitors. Judge Henderson, a retired judge and friend of my grandparents, and the local police chief, Helena Duarte. Both had received personal letters from my grandfather before his death. "He trusted you both very much," Matthew said as he introduced them. My eyes filled with tears. Another layer of protection had arrived. Henderson was direct. He wanted to see the evidence, hear the witnesses, and ensure everything was done legally. Helena, for her part, promised to formally investigate the thefts, threats, and fraud. Their presence changed the atmosphere of the house. What once seemed like an emotional defense now gained legal and institutional weight. They stayed for hours, listening attentively, taking notes, analyzing documents. In the end, Henderson said, "Emma, this is not just a matter of inheritance. This is a matter of justice." I felt a strange warmth in my chest. I was no longer fighting alone against ghosts. I was surrounded by true guardians. With their blessing, we began to outline the next steps with even more confidence. Justice, which seemed so distant, now walked by my side. And I, who once feared tomorrow, began to await it with firmness. It was no longer an inheritance dispute. It was justice. That night, we gathered everyone in the main living room. The dim lights, the organized piles of papers, and the serious faces created a scene that seemed straight out of a movie. Matthew led the organization. Each document would have its function, each witness their moment. It was a real operation, careful and emotionally charged. Judge Henderson guided the legal details, while Helena explained the protocol to protect the integrity of the house and those involved. We didn't know how my family would react, but we needed to be prepared for the worst. Carlos, as always, was in charge of security and surveillance. Everyone there had a role, and everyone knew its importance. I went to sleep that night with a copy of my grandmother's diary next to my pillow. I read a passage where she said, "When Emma is tested, she will know where she stands." I didn't know if I was ready, but I knew I couldn't back down. This was my life. This was my family's story, and I wouldn't allow it to be distorted. Tomorrow they would come, and I would no longer be a passive pawn in their game. I would be the voice they always tried to silence, and this time everyone would hear. Tomorrow would decide more than a will. The doorbell rang like a final alarm. From the gate, I saw my father in front, followed by my mother Brandon and surprisingly Aunt Margaret. All well-dressed, rehearsed, with folders in their hands and superior glances. They entered uninvited, as if the house still belonged to them. Carlos remained by my side, firm as ever, ready for whatever came. "We are here to resolve this civilly," my father said, as if the destruction they had caused could be erased with diplomacy. Carolyn adopted a sweeter tone, but her eyes gleamed with arrogance. Brandon let out muffled chuckles, scoffing at the paintings, the furniture, at me. Aunt Margaret cried discreetly, but her sobs seemed part of a poorly rehearsed script. They didn't want to talk. They wanted control. They presented a document with flimsy arguments, tried to disqualify my emotional state, even cited my incapacity to manage the estate. All with well-chosen, manipulative words. But what hurt most was their gaze. Empty of affection, full of greed. It was as if my pain was invisible. I took a deep breath. This was my home, and I would no longer be a pawn in their charade. Even if my voice trembled, I would speak. Even if they shouted, I would resist. Because I knew what came next. They thought they just had to knock on the door and take what they wanted. I waited for everyone to finish speaking, and then walked to the center of the room. Beside me, Matthew opened the main folder, and I began to distribute copies of documents to those present. Judge Henderson entered the room with his imposing demeanor, followed by Chief Helena. My parents took a step back, surprised. The letters, the videos, the diaries, they were all there. I spoke calmly, even with my heart pounding. I presented the recordings of the thefts, my grandmother's accounts, the forged contracts. I showed that behind every accusation they made against me, there was an undeniable truth on my side. Every voice they wanted to silence was now being heard by everyone. Minute by minute the masks fell. Brandon tried to interrupt, but Helena silenced him with authority. My mother maintained her composure, but her hands trembled. My father still tried to argue, but the weight of the evidence made him hesitate. For the first time they were being confronted with who they really were, and there was no longer any escape. I looked into each of their eyes. Not with hatred, but with the firmness of someone who no longer fears. There, at that moment, I ceased to be merely the heir. I was the voice of my grandparents, the guardian of their memory, and the woman who learned to stand up even when everything was collapsing. For the first time I was heard and respected. It was Aunt Margaret who broke the silence first. She began to babble disconnected words, walking in circles, saying it was all a scam. "This is a trap. They poisoned you against us," she shouted, her eyes watery and her arms gesticulating in the air. The tension finally exploded. She knocked over a vase, tore papers from the table, and cried like a lost child. My mother tried to restrain her, but she too seemed on the verge of collapse. Brandon muttered obscenities under his breath. Cornered. My father, perhaps the most proud among them, merely watched everything in silence. His jaw clenched and his fists closed. They were undone. Arrogance gave way to fear, and the power they thought they had slipped through their fingers. Henderson stood up and announced that all evidence would be handed over to the Justice Department. Helena reinforced that measures would be taken to prevent reprisals. I observed them, all of them, not with hatred but with a clarity that surprised me. That scene was the reflection of truth asserting itself. The play was over. My grandparents would be proud. Not because I won but because I resisted. Because I defended what was theirs and what was mine with dignity. There, before everyone, a new story began to be written. Not the one they wanted, but the one I chose. The tables turned before everyone's eyes. The room was full. In addition to those directly involved, there were legal representatives, witnesses, and journalists invited by Henderson. What began as a family confrontation turned into a public act of truth. A large screen was set up. And one by one the videos began to be displayed. The post-funeral invasion, the thefts, the cold smiles of Brandon and my father. Then came excerpts from my grandmother's diaries. Excerpts read aloud by myself. I spoke with a firm voice, even when emotion threatened to break me. Her words, sweet and firm, narrated the story of a family divided between love and greed. And they showed, beyond a shadow of a doubt, who was who in this story. The legal documents appeared next. Suspicious transfers, attempts at interdiction, manipulated contracts. Each page turn was like a sentence. My parents tried to hide their faces. Brandon had already left the room. Margaret cried in a corner, huddled. Their image, once so proud, was now in ruins. I remained standing next to Matthew, my hands trembling but firm. That wasn't just justice. It was redemption. And it was also, in a way, a farewell. My grandparents were there, in every line, in every image, in every gesture of mine. And finally they were being heard. The masks fell one by one. When everything had been displayed, I looked directly at my parents. For the first time there was no distance, no pretense. Just the three of us face to face, no more characters. I spoke with the voice I had kept since childhood. You taught me to fear silence, but today it is my weapon. Because in my grandparents' silence there was love. And in your noise only selfishness. My mother started to respond, but I raised my hand, asking them to listen to me. It's not about money. If it were, I would have accepted that dirty deal in your office. It's about respect. About memory. About who truly loved me in this life. My father lowered his gaze. For the first time, without reaction. Tears came, but I let them fall. It was the last time I would speak to them with such an open heart. You chose the path of greed. I chose the path of truth. And now, everyone reaps what they have sown. I walked away, letting my words do what they had always tried to avoid, reflect. There was no response. Just silence. And in that silence I won. It wasn't for money. It was for love and respect. Matthew announced that, based on all the evidence presented, legal measures would be taken immediately. Helena handed subpoenas and reports to the family's lawyers. They were surrounded. No more threats, no more manipulations. They tried to leave discreetly, but the impact had already been made. The masks were on the floor. And the world now saw who they were. The assets were protected. The inheritance secured. But more than that, my grandparents' name had been cleared, preserved, honored. That was what mattered. There was no greater victory than truth brought to light. I didn't want to see them imprisoned or humiliated. I just wanted them to be prevented from hurting again. When everyone left, I sat on the porch stairs and took a deep breath. It was the end of one cycle, and the beginning of another. The tears that fell now were of relief, of a mission accomplished. I had done what I promised myself on that first night in that house, to protect the memory of those who loved me unconditionally. Carlos sat beside me, silent as always. And together we watched the sunset. For the first time without fear of tomorrow. They left defeated, for the first time without power. Now, I'm curious about you who heard my story. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Have you experienced something similar? Support the channel by subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing this video. I'm leaving another story on the end screen that you'll also like, and it will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.